Okay, so it is exactly 10 a.m. Good morning, everyone. Today's ORO session is called Clinical Trials Defined, and we are going to ask for any questions that you just try to hold them to the end. We'll have plenty of time at the end to go over questions. And Sevie, whenever you're ready.
Yeah, so I'm Sevie Kandefer. I currently work at the Clinical Research Office here at UB, but I've worked in research for over 20 years, mostly as a research coordinator and mostly on industry-sponsored clinical trials. So with the recent push to increase the number of clinical trials here at UB, I thought we'd break down what makes a study a clinical trial. So we'll dive right in. At the CRO, we use the NIH definition of a clinical trial. So that definition is a research study in which one or more human subjects are prospectively assigned to one or more interventions, which may include placebo or other control, to evaluate the effects of those interventions on health-related, biomedical, or behavioral outcomes. So the NIH has a decision tree that you can find online where you can use the following 4 questions to determine the difference between a clinical study and a clinical trial. And we're just going to go through these questions one by one. The first question is, does the study involve human participants research? So what is a human participant? If you go to the NIH website, they define human subjects research as research involving a living individual about whom data or biospecimens are obtained, used, studied, analyzed through interaction, intervention, or identifiable private information is used, studied, analyzed, and generated. Examples of human subjects research include collecting blood, administering medicine or using a device, collecting data through surveys, interviews, or focus groups. Could be changing participants' environment, administering a psychological test, or testing a new educational technique. Obviously, this is not a comprehensive list, but just some examples. Now, different organizations like the FDA have their own definition of what a human subject is. The NIH definition really mirrors the Health and Human Services Policy for Protection of Human Research Subjects definition, which defines a human subject as a living individual about whom an investigator, whether professional or student conducting research, obtains information or biospecimens through intervention or interaction with the individual, and then uses, studies, or analyzes the information or biospecimens, or the investigator obtains, uses, studies, analyzes, or generates identifiable private information or identifiable biospecimens. So if we just look at part 1 of this definition, it's where investigators obtain information or biospecimens through intervention or interaction with the individual. What we mean when we say intervention, that would include both physical procedures by which investigators collect information or biospecimens and manipulations of these subjects or the subject's environment for the purpose of the research. An interaction would occur when investigators communicate or have interpersonal contact with research participants, and that could be verbally, it could be in writing or electronically to obtain information about them. So part 2 of this definition is when identifiable private information or biospecimens are obtained, used, studied, or analyzed, or generated. Now, the determining factor here is whether the information or biospecimens are identifiable. That is, the identity of the person is either known or could be readily ascertained by the investigator or research team. And deciding whether information or biospecimens in this context is contextual, is what I'm going to say. This is not HIPAA. HIPAA is a separate regulation. There is no list of identifiers. This is really a contextual determination. So a human subject is a living individual about whom an investigator obtains information or biospecimens through intervention or interaction with the individual, and then uses, studies, or analyzes that information or biospecimens. Or it's when the investigator obtains, uses, studies, analyzes, or generates identifiable private information or identifiable biospecimens. So your research may fall under the umbrella of human subjects research, even if your research doesn't involve direct interactions with humans. Federal requirements to protect human subjects may apply to research on human specimens like cells, blood, and urine. residual diagnostic specimens, and medical information. So let's say you have a study where you want to analyze discarded tissue from surgery. Patients are going to undergo a standard of care procedure, and then tissue will be discarded, and that tissue is perfect for your study. That's still human subjects research. So human subjects protections do extend to that tissue, and you would most likely need to obtain consent. So research involving existing data, documents, records, pathological specimens, diagnostic specimens, or tissues that are identifiable is considered research involving humans. So your chart reviews, your record reviews, those things are also human subjects research. Some research may qualify for an exemption from federal regulatory requirements, but it's still considered human subjects research. So if your research involves human participants, you would go to the next question, or are those participants prospectively assigned to an intervention? So we've said an intervention includes both physical procedures by which investigators collect information or biospecimens and manipulations of the subjects or the subject's environment for the purpose of the research. So some examples of interventions include the use of drugs, small molecules or compounds, biologics or devices. Now, a medical device can be anything from a stent to a toothbrush. So it's not, a device isn't just like those big devices we think of, like I said, a toothbrush, dental floss. Those things are also medical devices and would be an intervention. Procedures, if you might be looking at different surgical techniques, that would be considered an intervention. Delivery systems. So if you have a study where you're interviewing people face to face versus virtually, that delivery system is the intervention. Strategies to change healthcare or to change health-related behaviors. If your study is looking at diets, therapies, exercises, changing or developing habits, those are interventions. And so are treatment strategies, prevention strategies, and diagnostic strategies. So the question was, are the participants prospectively assigned to an intervention? So in a clinical trial, it is the researcher who assigns participants to get one or more intervention to test what happens in people. These are also called interventional studies, and the intervention can be investigational, which means that it's not approved for doctors to prescribe to people. In an observational study, a researcher is simply collecting information from the participants or looking at data that was already collected. And the data may be about a participant's health habits or environment, but the researcher is not assigning participants to get an intervention. There could still be an intervention in an observational study, but participants were already using it or going to get it as part of their regular healthcare or daily life. So the main difference is if the researchers assign the participants to get an intervention, it may be a clinical trial. And that could be randomly assigned, it could be double-blind, placebo-controlled. It doesn't matter. The difference is that the researcher is assigning it. In an observational study, the researchers aren't assigning the intervention. If there is an intervention, participants were already going to get it or use it as part of standard of care or their daily life. So if you have human subjects that are being prospectively assigned to an intervention by the researcher, the next question you would ask is the study designed to evaluate the effect of the intervention on the participants. So we have examples of interventions. You're really looking to see, does that intervention affect your participants? If the study is designed to evaluate the effect of the intervention on the participant, you may have a clinical trial. If the study is designed only to validate the sensitivity or specificity of a tool or gather feedback about the intervention, then that is not a clinical trial. So if you have a study, let's say you're recruiting women over the age of 75 and you're giving them a new exercise program, and then you ask them questions like, how easy are the exercises? How long did it take you to do the exercises? Do you have the equipment to do the exercises? You're not actually measuring the effect of the exercise program on the participants themselves. You are simply gathering feedback about that intervention, and that would not be a clinical trial. If you were going to look at changes in weight or strength or cardiovascular fitness, then that would be a clinical trial, because then you're looking at the effect of the exercise program on those participants. So you're seeing if your study has human participants that are prospectively assigned to an intervention. The study is designed to evaluate the effect of the intervention on the participants. If the answer to those questions are yes, then you ask, is the effect being evaluated a health-related biomedical or behavioral outcome? A health-related biomedical or behavioral outcome is defined as the pre-specified goal or condition that reflects the effect of one or more interventions on human subjects' biomedical or behavioral status or quality of life. So examples include positive or negative changes to physiological or biological parameters like lung capacity or gene expression. It could be changes to psychological or neurodevelopmental parameters like mood or reading comprehension. It could be changes to disease processes, health-related behaviors, or quality of life. So if you're wondering if you are conducting a clinical trial, you need to make sure you have human participants, that the researcher is prospectively assigning an intervention. You're evaluating the effect of that intervention on the participants, and the effect being evaluated is a biomedical or behavioral outcome. If the answer to all of those questions are yes, then your study is a clinical trial according to the NIH definition. One no means it's not a clinical trial. And why does that matter, right? Like, if it's a clinical study, a clinical trial, does that really make a difference? It does, because there are different rules and regulations for clinical trials. So clinical trials involving investigational drugs, biologics, and devices are governed by specific FDA regulations. So, and again, a device could be dental floss. So you need to make sure that you're following whatever rules and regulations are applicable to your study. One of those regulations is registering your clinical trial on clinicaltrials.gov. So the requirement to register your study to clinicaltrials.gov is not limited to clinical trials involving drugs or devices. It depends on the type of trial you have, your funding source, and where you plan to publish your results. So just as an example, here is a summary table of the registration and reporting requirements. And so you can see, if you look at the FDA, the NIH, and ICMJE, which is the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, they each have different definitions of what a clinical trial is. They have different criteria for which studies need to be registered, different reporting requirements, different penalties. And so knowing what type of trial you have and knowing if it is a clinical trial will impact the rules and regulations that you need to follow. So you can see, like, the FDA requires all applicable clinical trials, which are mainly, drug and device studies. Some pediatric post-market surveillance studies need to be registered on clinicaltrials.gov. NIH says that clinical trials that are partially or fully funded by the NIH, regardless of whether the trial involves an FDA-regulated product, those need to be registered on clinicaltrials.gov. ICMJE says if you want to publish in one of our member journals, you need to register your trial at clinicaltrials.gov. So knowing what type of trial you have or what type of study, it impacts the rules and regulations you need to follow. And if you ever have any questions about clinicaltrials.gov, because clearly it's not as simple as you want it to be, please reach out to Lynn or Mo at the CTSI, and they can help you determine if your study does need to be registered, help you register it, help you report your results. Their contact information is here, and they are excellent, and they will help you navigate this one regulation that is required of clinical trials. So in addition to federal regulations, it matters at UB whether or not you have a clinical trial. So most of you are probably in a health science school. You're probably familiar with Central Study Registration, or CSR, which is where you're usually entering your study first when you have a chart review or a human subject study. That's where you're entering your study. However, even if you're not in a health science school and you are conducting a clinical trial that meets this NIH definition, you are expected to enter your study into CSR first. You do not put it directly into Click IRB. And if you do, what will happen most likely is the IRB will come back and say, no, this has to go in CSR. And then you have to go back and put it in CSR after you've already put it into Click. When you do enter your study into CSR, there is a drop-down box, I think, that asks you what type of study you have, and one of those options is clinical trial. And that, yes, on that question, that selection of a clinical trial, that gets reported to up the chain to schools, to your deans. It gets reported up the leadership here at the university. It also gets reported at a state level to RF. So the university is tracking the number of clinical trials that are being done here. Now, part of that reason is for grant submissions. So, for example, when the CTSI has to submit their CTSA proposal for funding, one of the questions asked is how many clinical trials is your institution doing? So having an accurate number of the clinical trials going on here, it's important for reporting reasons. It's important for grant submissions. It's also important for how your study gets set up in UB business systems. So how it goes into click agreements or Encore, it depends on the type of study you have. So accurately entering your study is helpful. And eventually that'll just save you time. So if you know what kind of study you have and you know the rules and regulations that you need to follow, hopefully that makes startup a little bit more smoothly, because nobody wants to hear, oh, but you have to go back and do this. Oh, but you have to go back and register at clinicaltrials.gov. You have to go back and put it in CSR. If you just know what you need to do ahead of time, it hopefully makes things go more smoothly and save you time. Okay, so this is the interactive portion of the presentation. I have some case studies to review, and the interaction is this a clinical trial or not? It's a one question. There'll be a QR code. You do have to scan it each time. All the examples are taken from the NIH website. So if you don't like the example or you disagree with the answer, please take it up with NIH, because I simply copied it. You can find all the cases online at the URL here. So let's see. We know the difference. So, okay, this study, this involves the recruitment of research participants with disease X to receive an investigational drug. It is designed to assess whether there is a change in disease progression compared to baseline. There is no concurrent control used in this study. Is it a clinical trial? So hopefully if you scan the QR code, you'll get the question. It's just a yes or a no. I've had a lot of technical difficulties this morning, so we'll see if this works. Let's see. Okay, and it looks like people think, yes, it's a clinical trial. Oh, sorry if I went too fast, but it is, yes. You're right, it is a clinical trial. The study involves human participants that are being prospectively assigned to receive an intervention, the investigational drug. The study is designed to evaluate the effect of the investigational drug on the subject's disease progression, and disease progression is a health-related outcome. So that is a clinical trial. Next one. This study involves the analysis of de-identified stored blood samples and de-identified medical records of patients with disease X who were treated with an approved drug. The study is designed to evaluate the level of protein in the blood of patients that is associated with therapeutic effects of the drug. You have to scan this QR code. You have to scan it each time, so I'm sorry. But is this a clinical trial? Let's see. Okay. Okay, and we think it is not, and that is correct. It is not a clinical trial. It does not involve human participants because only de-identified samples and information are used. Okay, this study involves the recruitment of individuals to receive a new behavioral intervention for sedentary behavior. It is designed to measure the effect of the intervention on hypothesized differential mediators of behavior change. So is it a clinical trial? Okay. You think yes. And yes, it is. It involves human participants who are prospectively assigned to receive a behavioral intervention. The study is evaluating the effects of the intervention on mediators of behavior change. And mediators of behavior change is a behavioral outcome that is relevant to health. So it is a clinical trial. This study involves the recruitment of physicians who will be randomly assigned to use a new app or an existing app, which cues directed interviewing techniques. The study is designed to determine whether the new app is better than the existing app at assisting physicians in identifying families in need of social service support. The number of community service referrals will be measured. Is it a clinical trial? We think no. It is. It enrolls human participants. Both the physician and families are the human participants. The physicians are prospectively assigned to use one of two apps, which are the interventions. The study is designed to evaluate the effect of intervening with physicians on social service support referrals for families. The number of referrals is a health-related outcome, so it is a clinical trial. Okay, I think two more. Okay, this study will test the feasibility of a mobile phone app designed to increase physical activity. A group of sedentary individuals will use the app for a week while their interactions with the app are monitored. The number of interactions with the app will be measured, as well as any software issues. Participants will also complete a survey indicating their satisfaction and willingness to use the app, as well as any feedback for improvement. The app's effect on physical activity, weight, or cardiovascular fitness will not be evaluated. Is this a clinical trial? This one's tougher. This is not a clinical trial. It is enrolling human participants that are sedentary individuals. They are interacting with the app for a week. While the participants' interactions are monitored, the study is not measuring the effect of using the app on the participant. The study is only measuring the usability and acceptability of the app and testing for bugs in the software. The effect on physical activity is not being measured, so it is not a clinical trial. Okay, last one. A study involves the recruitment of children at two schools to evaluate their preferences for graphics and colors used in healthy food advertisements. Children will be presented with multiple health advertisements, and their preferences for graphics and colors will be assessed. So is this a clinical trial? What do we think? Okay, we think no, and that is correct. It is enrolling human participants. Participants are prospectively assigned to see different advertisements, and the study is designed to evaluate the advertisements, but the preferences are not health-related biomedical or behavioral outcomes, so this would not be a clinical trial. Okay, so if you are looking for clinical trial support at UB, especially if you or your investigator are initiating a clinical trial and designing it yourself, there is a new VPHS Office of Clinical Trial Development and Implementation. It's headed by Dr. Wilding from the Department of Biostatistics. I could not find a website. I believe it is under development, but there is a YouTube video where Dr. Wilding talks about the different services offered. So this is a really great resource if you are looking to design and power your own clinical trial. And of course, you can always reach out to the CRO, no matter what type of study you have, no matter what your funding is, or if it's unfunded. If you have questions about if your study is a clinical trial or how to move your study through the UB systems, please feel free to reach out to the CRO. So I have email addresses, phone numbers for staff at the CRO. So anytime you have any questions at all, please reach out. So thank you. That's all I have. I don't know if anybody has any questions.
I don't see any in the chat, and I don't see anyone's hand up. So if no one has a question, Sevie, thank you very much. And this will be posted online for anyone that came in late or just wants to rewatch it. It'll be posted in a few days.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.